Thank you very much again for accepting the invitation. We are any honor today, Professor, to have you in the meeting. Um, we have not started yet, but the questions are coming. So, so the questions would be at the end. So just my friends, just type your questions, and I will ask them at the end. So, my friends and I can see a number of colleagues, also university professors, have come to the meeting. Professor Shahbazi, I can see him. So thank you very much for joining the meeting. And after a very brief introduction of Professor Newberg, we will have his presentation. So Professor Andrew Newberg, he's a medical doctor. He's a professor in integrative medicine. He's also a professor at the Department of Radiology at Thomas Jefferson University. He's a neuroscientist who studies the relationship between brain function and various mental states. He's a pioneer in the neurological study of religious and spiritual experiences, and this field is known as neurotheology, and the professor will explain better about that. His research includes taking brain scans of people in prayer, during prayer, meditation, rituals, and trance states in an attempt to better understand the nature of religious and spiritual practices and attitudes. So if you are interested in these fields, you should know the professor. He is a very pioneer in the field, and many people know him. In terms of the books published, as long as I have seen, he has already published over 11 books. They're very interesting books. To be honest, I have never read them before, but I have in my plan to read at least 2 of them, and I say which one of them. So the title of a few of the books include Brain Weaver, The Rabbit's Brain, Neurotheology, Principles of Neurotheology, How God Changes Your Brain, Why God Won't Go Away, and The Mystical Mind. And in terms of his publications, based on his Google Scholar profile, he has over 500 papers. That's too many. I'm not sure how you can have time for preparing that many papers, but anyway, he has over 500 papers, over 20,000 citations, an H index of 70, and an I-10 index of 192. So my friends and colleagues, we should know that we have a very prestigious professor today, and he is a pioneer in his field. And this is indeed an honor for us to have you, Professor, and we are totally ready to listen to your talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor and a privilege to be able to speak with all of you today. I'm very excited to be able to share a lot of information about the research that I've been involved in, really going back about 30 years. It's hard to imagine that I'm that old, but it's been very exciting to be part of that research. And I should say from the outset that one particular connection I have with all of you is that my mentor in the field of neuroimaging is a Dr. Abbas Alavi, who was at the University of Pennsylvania for many years, still there. And his family, he grew up in Tabriz, and so speaks very fondly of his home. And we've celebrated many wonderful holidays and opportunities to learn about his background, as well as to discuss the value and the possibilities of what neuroimaging can do, both in terms of understanding the human brain with regard to a variety of different psychological and neurological conditions, as well as being able to study some very fascinating topics such as the religious and spiritual beliefs, attitudes, and experiences that we have as human beings. So, so the talk today is titled The Principles of Neurotheology, and to kind of get into that with you, let me see how I do this here. There we go. Let me explain a little bit about what neurotheology is, and it's really the whole purpose of my talk today, which is to introduce you to this topic, and I hope that it's something that will be of great interest to each of you, because for me, the field of neurotheology is a very unique field of scholarship. It seeks to understand the relationship specifically between the brain and theology, as the term would go, but more broadly between the mind and religion. And of course, there's certainly been a great deal of attention that has been garnered by this topic. There's been lots of articles, both in the academic literature as well as in many popular areas, and so there's really been a great deal of interest, both on the scientific side as well as on the religious side, at trying to understand what this overall relationship is. And for many years, maybe even thousands of years, there's often been a bit of a tension between science and religion. And I think this area of the brain is an area where they can really come together in a very positive and constructive way. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn. I also think that it really spans from very, very practical, even clinical perspectives, in terms of how we might help people dealing with psychological issues like depression, for example, or anxiety, by helping them to engage a religious or spiritual belief system that might be helpful as part of that process, to understanding the mind and consciousness, to starting to think about theological and philosophical conditions and topics. So it really goes from the very, very practical to the very esoteric and philosophical. And that, to me, is what makes this as a field very, very exciting. And I hope that each one of you, irrespective of where you are in your own studies and in the way in which you engage the brain, and the way in which you engage your religious or spiritual background, that hopefully there's something in here that you can gain some knowledge from, and perhaps utilize this as you go forward in your own paths and in your own journeys. So, but what has happened over time, as I said, I've been doing this for about 30 years. And over time, as more and more people asked questions about it, I realized that for it to be a viable field going forward, we really needed to have a clear set of principles by which neurotheology may proceed. So I started to write these ideas down as principles, ultimately published it in a book called Principles of Neurotheology. And while I'm not going to get into all of them here, I want to hit a few of the highlights and talk about this in the context of what this field has to offer. So, oops, sorry. Now, for the principles of neurotheology to kind of work, I think that there are a number of different areas that need to be addressed. And in the context of this group, scientific perspectives and methodology, very, very important. How do we design a study to take a brain scan of somebody who is praying? How do we decide what types of qualitative information we need to get from people? How do we ask certain questions? How do we begin to incorporate the religious and the theological ideas and perspectives? How do we do all of this in a way that maintains both sides as effectively as possible? And to that end, I think that whatever principles we ultimately settle upon, they need to be generally agreed upon by both the religious perspective as well as the scientific one. If they're only good for the science, then it doesn't really have any value from the perspective of religious or spiritual beliefs. And if it's very heavily based on religion and spirituality, then the science might get lost. So I think it's really very important for us to look at neurotheology as a true two-way street. It's not just religion talking about science, it's not just science talking about religion, but it's bringing the two of them together in a way that helps us to understand who we are as human beings. And that, to me, is one of the overarching goals of what neurotheology is ultimately all about. Now, I should take one quick step back and say that while neurotheology has perhaps as a concept or as a field grown in the last 25, 30 years, because we have had this incredible explosion of research in the brain and brain scan abilities to look at everything from depression and anxiety, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, to various types of thought processes, creative thinking, music, the way we think about morals, and ultimately the way we think about religious and spiritual beliefs. So this has all happened in the last 30 years, but I would argue that the foundations of neurotheology go back thousands of years. The Buddhist and Hindu perspectives certainly placed a great deal of emphasis on the mind, on the notion of the self, and on the notion of consciousness and how that all kind of comes together in us as individuals, and how we can engage that in constructive ways to hopefully bring us to some enlightenment, some greater sense of self, some greater sense of connection between ourselves and the universe, or the spiritual realm, depending on your perspective. And of course, the monotheistic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, also place a great deal of emphasis on human thoughts and behaviors. The notion that whatever a given tradition is asking us to do has to take into consideration who we are as individuals. And in many ways, all of these traditions are about kind of becoming the best human being that we can be. But that requires an understanding of what that means and who we are as people. There's so much emphasis on moral reasoning and moral thought, the behaviors that we should have, ways in which we can think positively and constructively, ways that we can improve ourselves, improve our communities and our world. So I think, even though they didn't have brain scans back then, there was this notion that there are ways in which we can understand who we are as human beings. Now, more recent developments, again, in the last maybe 20 or 30 years, I already mentioned one of my great mentors, Dr. Abbas Alavi. The other one was Dr. Eugene DeQuilly, who was a psychiatrist also at the University of Pennsylvania, where I studied and worked for the first part of my career. And he took an anthropological perspective, trying to understand how the human brain has developed and evolved over time, and how that is associated with different rituals, different practices, different beliefs. Other scholars have tried to get at these questions. There is a gentleman named James Ashbrook who wrote a book called The Humanizing Brain. This takes a bit of a more Christian-based perspective. Ron Josephs wrote a book called Neurotheology, which has various, it's an edited volume, which has different perspectives within that book. James Austin wrote a book called Zen and the Brain, so that has a more Buddhist perspective. And in fact, to jump perhaps to the end, I mean, part of what I am hoping to be able to do in this next phase of my own research is to explore the various traditions and really focus on them individually. And so we've been starting to do that, and I do have intentions of looking at all of the traditions from this neurotheological perspective, and what might be learned, how we might be able to, again, enhance our ability to engage those traditions as effectively as possible. But there's still so much for us to learn as well, advancing our methodologies, improving our brain imaging studies, and even looking at alternative ways. There are so many different things that we can think about with regard to this field of study. So this brings us to the first principle in my book, Principles of Neurotheology, which is what I refer to as the principle of definitions, that neurotheology should strive to provide and seek clear definitions for the topics of its inquiry. And what I mean by that is that so oftentimes, even in the scientific world, we don't really know what each of us are talking about. We may use the same term, but not truly understand what we mean by that. And so when we talk about, especially in the context of religion and spirituality, in fact, even those two terms, what is a religion? What is the difference between a cult and a religion? What are the differences between and across different traditions, different sects within a tradition? How do we think about those in the context? And how do we differentiate religion from spirituality? And of course, there are other topics, terms that I've already mentioned, things like mind, consciousness, soul, for example. Each of these have different definitions. And what's interesting to me is that the sources of those definitions can also be very varied. We could take a scientific perspective. How would we define consciousness from a scientific perspective? But how would we define consciousness from a religious perspective, from a philosophical perspective? So there are many different ways in which we can get at these definitions. And I think that most likely whatever definitions we may settle on today, these are definitely going to change over time as we do new research and new scholarship. So while we might be able to establish that consciousness is a set of different brain processes that lead to a self-identification, we may realize that that isn't a sufficient definition, and we may need to add in the philosophical and the theological perspectives as well. So, but at the very least, I think it's always important for people to at least set out what their definitions are so that we know what each person is talking about as we begin to discuss and dialogue about whatever their conclusions may be. Now, here's an example of where definitions come into play. This was a little study that we did. It was an N of 1 study, so we only looked at one individual. This is the first brain scan I'm going to be showing you, but there will be others that will be coming. One of the things that we have done is study people during different kinds of practices, like meditation and prayer and so forth. So I had a friend who considered himself to be an atheist, and I said, well, you know, why don't we have you, but he loved to meditate. So I said, well, instead of your usual focus of meditation, why don't you try contemplating God, meditating on the concept of God? And when we looked at his brain scan, and this is a SPECT scan, so this is a single photon emission computed tomography scan that looks at changes in cerebral blood flow. And on the left is the baseline scan. On the right is while he was in his meditation state. What you see is not really a lot changing. His frontal lobes don't really change very much, which is what I have at the top of the scan here, the prefrontal cortex. Maybe they drift down a little bit. The red areas are the most active, followed by the yellow, the blue, and the black. But overall, we didn't really see very much change. So the implication here was that if you ask somebody who isn't particularly religious to try to do something religious, they don't do very much. And I guess on one hand, that's not a surprise, but I guess, you know, in the context of definitions, was he even really doing something religious or spiritual? If I ask somebody who doesn't believe in God to contemplate God, what am I actually asking them to do? And so while this is kind of an intriguing little exercise for us to look at, it brings to the fore this issue about definitions. And if we're going to ask people to pray, what do we mean by prayer? There are many different kinds of prayer, and different traditions have different types of prayer. So are we able to compare them across traditions, within traditions, and what are we actually asking people to do? So these kinds of definitional issues, which is the main reason that I show you this study, we never even published this, but it was just an intriguing little finding. I think it tells us something about how we understand what these concepts are and how we can start to think about them. So the definition of neurotheology has to do with, again, I want to come back now to the definition of neurotheology, which in its most simple form refers to the field of study that links the neurosciences with religion and theology. I mentioned earlier that this is not a neuroscientific study of theology, and it is not a theological study of neuroscience. And I think for the most part, for neurotheology to be successful, the science must be kept very rigorous, but the religion must also be kept religious. And what I mean by that is that that it's important for, as I was just talking about, if we're asking somebody to pray, I think it's important that we understand what that means for the person. Are they actually doing the prayer the way they normally would, so that we can understand it and know that when we're looking at their brain, that we really understand what it is that we're looking at. So that to me is very important. And then I think also that the neuro and the theology sides must be defined very broadly. What I mean by that is that neuro is not just neuroscience, but it can be neuroimaging, it can be psychiatry, it can be biology because of the ways in which our immune system and our hormones begin to interact with our brain. So there's a lot of different ways, maybe even anthropological perspectives, that are all part of the neuro side. And of course, theology is a very specific discipline that has to do with how a religion is kind of analyzed and dissected by people within that tradition. And we can look at that. We can look at various theological questions from the perspective of neurotheology. But we also have to expand this concept as well to include not just theology itself, but spirituality, practices like prayer, meditation, experiences that people may have, belief systems and beliefs that people may have, the moral and ethical elements. So there are so many different things that we can look at for neurotheology to be a viable field. So I think these are all the questions that must be addressed when it comes to what neurotheology actually is. Now, I mentioned earlier the idea of methodology. And so one of the principles is that theology and neuroscience must allow for new methods, concepts, and conclusions to arise from neurotheological scholarship. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the current methods that we have may wind up being a little too limited. In the scientific world, of course, one of the most common things to do is to study lots of different people in one condition and compare them to another condition. So it might be great to bring in 30 people who are going to do prayer and compare them, or 30 religious people to 30 non-religious people and see where the differences are in their brain. And that can be useful. But the downside is that that misses a lot of individual aspects of religion and spirituality. Each person experiences their religious beliefs and their practices a little bit differently than the next person. And so trying to understand those inter-individual differences could be very important. And can we use brain scans to do that? Can we try to ask questions in certain ways? Do we need to use multidisciplinary approaches that not only combine brain imaging, but combine psychological analyses, descriptions of people's experiences, qualitative descriptions, and so forth? Ultimately, I think there must be a wide array of variables that we need to consider that'll be important for us to think about in the context of developing the methodology. And I've become really fascinated by the ways in which we can challenge ourselves. It's really a challenge to science to be able to come up with ways of grabbing at something that is very challenging and very difficult to get a hold of. It's something very qualitative, subjective, personal. And so trying to get an understanding of that from any kind of scientific perspective is a great deal, is a real challenge for science. But of course, in fields like psychiatry, where we're trying to understand depression or pain or anxiety, we have to ask questions. We have to ask a person, how depressed are you? How anxious are you? And we try to get at different ways of analyzing that. So, there are ways of using our biology, our biological measures, our neurological measures, but we also need to understand what the person is feeling. And so methodology becomes very interesting and very important for us to explore. Now, as I mentioned, some of our early work was done looking at practices like meditation. And so what we did was we used SPECT imaging a lot. Part of the reason that we did this is that SPECT imaging has one very particularly useful aspect to it, which is that you don't have to be in the scanner when you give the person an injection of a radioactive tracer that goes up into their brain. So you can have somebody in a room where they may be seated or moving or doing certain things that are part of a practice. We put an IV catheter in their arm that allows them the freedom to move around and do different things. So they're in as natural an environment as possible to do the practice. We inject them with this radioactive tracer while they're doing the practice, but it goes in through the IV so they don't feel it. It doesn't disrupt them or anything like that. They continue the practice while this tracer gets up into their brain. And then after the practice is over, we move them into the scanner and we obtain a picture of what their brain was doing at the time of the practice. Now, techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, obviously have other real advantages over SPECT imaging, especially in terms of temporal resolution and even spatial resolution, but you have to be in the scanner while you're doing the practice. And that sometimes can be a challenge. Sometimes there are practices that you can do that with, but there are other practices that are very difficult and challenging to do that with. So we keep using our different abilities of imaging to be able to, depending on what kind of practice that they're doing. So this was a study of Buddhist meditation practices. And one of the things that you see here is that in the baseline state, when they're just at rest, you see a fairly symmetric and equal amount of cerebral blood flow. This is what this is measuring in the person in both the frontal areas as well as in the back of the brain where the parietal lobe is. But when the person goes deep into meditation and we inject them the second time, we see that the parietal lobe begins to become much less active. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the parietal lobe normally is involved in our spatial representation of the self and how we kind of relate ourselves to the world. So we have proposed over the years that when people are engaged in deep meditation practices where they lose their sense of self or feel deeply connected with God or the universe or whatever it is that is their practice, that the parietal lobe activity would actually decrease, so that this area that normally is trying to create our sense of self and establish the boundary between the self and other begins to go away, and we lose that sense of self. And there's other concordant data with this, very interesting studies that have looked at people with brain lesions like tumors and strokes, that when they affect the parietal lobe, they are more likely to have feelings of self-transcendence, of getting beyond the self. So there's a lot of interesting corroborative data that the parietal lobe is very important here. But again, this is where we can use our methodologies to be able to see what's going on in the brain during a practice like this Buddhist meditation. A second principle related to methodology is that it is necessary to ensure that phenomenological characteristics of any given practice inform the neuroscientific perspective of the types of changes that might be expected. So going back to the scan that I was just looking at, it's one thing to say that the parietal lobe got less active, but we need to understand what the person is experiencing in order to know what that means. So too often science winds up measuring something that is not the thing that it's intended to measure. And so, unless we know and understand what the practice is, what it does, what the person feels, then we can't really integrate that phenomenology into the scientific measurement. And so, so what we have done over the years is develop various approaches to try to ask people those questions. What do you feel? How do you feel it? What is it? What does it do inside you? What are the cognitive elements, the emotional elements, the physical elements that are part of these experiences? And in fact, in an upcoming book that we're writing called The Varieties of Spiritual Experience, we're basing a lot of that on research that we did pretty much over a 10-year period now, where we received about 2,000 respondents to a survey of spiritual experiences. And we asked people about who they are. We got information about their age, their religious background. We got about 15 to 20% of people were from countries outside of the United States. Obviously, because we're here in the United States, a lot of the respondents were in the US. But I was excited that we got about 20% from outside, and really from almost every continent and every tradition. And we asked them questions about who they were. We had them answering various scales and questionnaires that have already been developed about their spirituality and so forth. But then to me, the real crux of this was to ask them and to provide a narrative description of their experiences. And so we have about 2,000 of these descriptions where people talk about what they feel when they feel religious and spiritual. And this is a little word cloud, I guess, that gets developed. So you see some of the biggest words are the ones that are used most often. So things like God, reality, spirituality, experience. But then as you get into the thick of it, the weeds, you get into things that people have seen, things that they think about, things that they feel about, that they sense. And so, we can then analyze this very quantitatively and help us to better understand what are the actual components of these spiritual experiences. So now we're not talking about kind of the quote unquote everyday experience. This is not just somebody walking into a church or a mosque to sit down and pray, but we're talking about people, in this particular case, we're talking about very intense experiences, transformative experiences. And so, but to us, there is also a continuum of these experiences. So just walking in to a place of worship elicits an experience that has some of these elements, but they exist along a continuum. And part of what we have found is that when people talk about their most intense experiences, they used words that relate to intensity, for example. So they'll say it was incredibly powerful. It was the most beautiful experience I ever had, the most beautiful music I ever heard, the greatest feeling of love. I was overwhelmed. It was infinite. So these kinds of experiences of intensity, very, very important. A sense of clarity, that people understand things for the first time. So, you know, when you suddenly realize that you now understand the way you need to be as a person, the way you need to be as a religious individual, this sense of clarity is fundamental to what these experiences are about. A sense of unity, a sense of connection between yourself and God, between yourself and the religious community. There's something that kind of connects you to something greater than the self. And that is also very, very important. A sense of surrender, a sense that the person kind of gives themselves to the experience, to the belief, to the tradition, to God. So that sense of letting go, release, there are different terms that people use. Surrender, of course, also very important. That to them was a very fundamental part of spiritual experiences. And then finally, a sense of permanence and I suppose transformation first, that they have been changed by this, but then a sense of permanence, that this is now the way that a person will be, and it transforms them permanently into a different way of thinking about the world. So these are some of the things that we get from that. Now we can start to try to relate this back to what's going on in the brain. We can ask, well, where does a sense of unity? We talked about the parietal lobe, and a little bit later we'll talk about feelings of surrender, for example. But you know, and even just how the brain changes in a period of time. These are very important aspects of these kinds of experiences. Now, when it comes to neurotheology and neuroscience, again, neurotheology should be applied to a wide range of cognitive processes and health-related issues. So this is the practical side of neurotheology, how we understand the human brain, how we understand the human mind, how that helps us to understand our psyche, especially when, you know, obviously it's great to understand what keeps our mind and our brain happy and healthy, but also what happens when things don't go so well. You know, what are the benefits of religious and spiritual phenomena on our mental and physical health, but what happens, and this to me is another really big area for neurotheology to move into. You know, we see things going on here in the United States, at least recently, with, you know, so many of these mass shootings and things like that, and often they're motivated by religious or racial kind of concepts. You know, what is it that takes a person's brain and goes down that direction? What is it that, you know, to me, I have known so many wonderful religious individuals in my life who are caring and loving and giving and open and try to help everybody. So obviously religion can lead to all of this wonderful aspects of all the wonderful aspects of humanity, but sometimes religion leads into negative and destructive processes. And so how do we understand that? How do we explain that? How do we understand the immoral aspects that arise either as part of a religious tradition or get kind of wrapped up in religion in a problematic way? And the ultimate hope, as an optimist myself, is can we find ways of redirecting those individuals who have gone down negative paths into something that is more positive and helps to contribute to not only to their own health and well-being, but to the health and well-being of their society, their community, their society, and the world at large. So I think that there's a lot of very practical aspects of neurotheology, and this pertains a little bit more to that neuroscience and clinical side of understanding who we are and how our brains and how our minds actually work. And this is just one little study that we did. We did about 15 individuals. We took a kind of secularized meditation practice called Kirtan Kriya, where you basically repeat certain sounds over and over. It's a mantra-based practice. It derives actually from the Kundalini yoga tradition. And you move your fingers to the sounds. It's a very simple concentrative meditation practice. In this case, in this context, it didn't have any religious or spiritual meaning, although it theoretically could. And what we did was we scanned their brains initially. In fact, these are 4 SPECT scans of the same individual at 4 different time points. So the A time point is what their brain looked like at rest initially when they just came into our lab. We taught them how to do this practice. It's a practice that takes 12 minutes, so it's relatively brief. We taught them how to do it, and they did the practice for the first time, and we scanned them again. That was the B scan. Then we had them go home and do the practice for 8 weeks on a daily basis. And then they came back and we scanned them again at rest. That's the C scan. And then we had them do the practice one final time, which was the D scan. And I think the most important thing to look at is the A and the C scans. So this is the resting brain state. And there's 2 main findings here. One is where the arrow is pointing. This is looking at the thalamus. So it's a very central structure. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what the thalamus does, but it coordinates, it relays a lot of information between different cortical areas. It's very involved in sensory processing, especially vision and hearing. And as you can see in the A scan, the one side is a little bit more active than the other. It's a little bit more red than the other. But when the person comes back after 8 weeks of doing this practice, there's much more balance. In fact, if anything, the other side might be a little bit more active. And when you look at the D scan, when they're doing the meditation, that other side becomes even more active. So, but to me, this is very exciting because just by doing a very simple practice for 8 minutes or for 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks, we changed the way their thalamus was working just at rest. And similarly, if you look, and I don't have an arrow here, but if you look towards the top of the scan at the frontal regions, you can see that there's more red in the C scan in the frontal lobes than there is in the A scan. So as part of the concentrative process where you typically use your frontal lobes, they were able to increase the activity levels in their frontal lobes. And this is consistent with other research which has shown that long-term meditators, meaning people who have been meditating for 15 plus years, literally have thicker frontal lobes than those people who are non-meditators. And so this is very exciting because, again, it shows what can happen in your brain simply by doing this practice. So, now extrapolate that to somebody who is doing a prayer practice their entire life. And what's going on in their brain when they now are 50 years old and they've been doing the same practice on a daily basis for 40, 50 years of their lives. It really changes the way our brain operates. And again, hopefully this is for the good, that hopefully it helps. We know that the frontal lobes help us to concentrate. In fact, in this study, we found that these changes correlated with improvements in memory and concentration and reductions in anxiety and depression. So if somebody is now engaged in a prayer practice on a daily basis, we might expect to see similar kinds of protective or beneficial effects. And of course, one doesn't do the prayer practice to get health benefits, but it's nice to know that there could be these concomitant changes that might be beneficial for people going forward. I've touched on consciousness a few times, and I think it is worth talking about in a little bit more detail. Certainly in the world of science and philosophy, there has been a great deal of attention applied to consciousness. And I think neurotheology offers us a very unique window into studying consciousness by exploring both traditional as well as non-traditional aspects. And what I mean by that is that we can look at the relationship between our brain and consciousness. That could be patients with different diseases like Alzheimer's disease, and as they lose their brain function, how does that change their notion of consciousness about themselves? But we also may be able to take highly proficient meditators, religious individuals who get into altered states of consciousness and what goes on in their brain when there's that shift. So there are many different aspects that we could look at. And of course, there has even been some fascinating research, although certainly controversial, that has tried to explore whether our consciousness can affect objects at a distance. Can we use our mind to somehow affect random number generators, or even through intercessory things like intercessory prayer, help to change another person's mind or the world or something in some way. So I think neurotheology should encourage exploration of consciousness and whether the material aspects of our brain, how they relate to consciousness. Is matter the primary, that consciousness derives from matter? Is consciousness primary and matter derives from consciousness? These are both fascinating scientific questions, but also philosophical and religious questions. And of course, in many ways, one would argue that the material world arose from the consciousness of God. So, there are so many different ways of thinking about this. And I think neurotheology offers some interesting perspectives in trying to address these kinds of questions about consciousness. And we even did some intriguing studies on people who get into altered states of consciousness, and they say that they can enter into a spiritual realm. So I had a colleague who was from Brazil, and he brought up into our lab about 10 individuals who were Brazilian mediums. So, they basically say that they are able to get into a trance-like state and can connect with spirits, people who have died, and be able to kind of communicate with them and relay what they're saying to them. Again, I'm not here to say whether that's true or not, but we can look at their brain when they're doing this practice. And it was actually a practice called psychography, where they write, and they say that they're writing down whatever these spirits are telling them to write down. And it was interesting that when they did these practices, that there were specific changes going on in the brain, including some areas of the frontal lobe, including the anterior cingulate, areas of the limbic system, such as the hippocampus. And what was interesting is that usually there were decreases in these areas, which was kind of interesting because some of the language areas that were involved, since they're doing a kind of language-based process, it was, I found it fascinating that the language areas were actually kind of quieting down instead of revving up, which is what one might expect. So, I don't know what this means in the big picture at the moment, but it's another little piece of the puzzle to help us to see what's going on during this kind of practice, and then compare it to other practices, people who consider themselves to be psychics, mediums, and so forth. There's a lot of people who believe that these types of practices and processes are possible. It's interesting to see what goes on in their brain and see if it can help us to understand what those practices are actually doing for people. And there could be, again, clinical applications of this, as well as philosophical and spiritual implications as well. Now, when it comes more specific to religious or theological concepts, I do feel that neurotheology has an opportunity, at least, to address pretty much any and all theological questions. Now, a really important point, this is not that neuroscience is going to answer those questions. It's, whatever religions talk about in terms of their beliefs and their concepts and so forth, that's part of the tradition, and that's something that isn't going to be changed or proven to be untrue or anything from the perspective of science, but maybe science can add something to the discussion, add something to the dialogue. So, for example, we've seen some scans of prayer. When people are in prayer, they feel that they're interacting with God. So, well, what's going on? How does our brain help us to do that? If we read a sacred text, it's our brain that's helping us to read that text and interpret what that means and make sense of it. And so how does that happen? How do we think about the nature of good and evil, free will? While certainly there are religious and theological perspectives on each of these concepts, we can do a brain scan of somebody who's a particularly good person. We can do a brain scan, and I've been involved in a number of criminal cases where we're doing brain scans of murderers, for example. And so what's the difference between a brain of somebody who's willing to kill another individual versus someone who desperately wants to help another individual? And ultimately, if we are to have some interaction with God, I would argue that clearly our brain is part of that process. It helps us to understand the sacred text. It helps us to pray. It helps us to understand what behaviors and ideas and thought processes to have. So I think neurotheology has an opportunity to contribute to these existing theological questions and add something to them. And I think, hopefully the future will help us to see where those directions may go. And with that in mind, we did publish a very small paper on individuals who were doing Islamic prayer. And I thought the results were really quite fascinating as well. A couple of main things that we noticed when it came to Islamic prayer was that here you see the scan on the left is the baseline scan. The scan on the right is during prayer. And one of the things that we noticed was that the frontal lobes, where the arrow is pointing, typically shut down during the practice of Islamic prayer. And I thought this made so much sense because it's very consistent with the qualitative experience, the notion of surrendering oneself to God. Well, your frontal lobes are what help us to sort of be purposeful and do the things and concentrate and make us do the things that we want to do in life. So when the frontal lobes shut down, we are giving over our conscious will, our willfulness to a given idea, given process or whatever. And so the fact that this was seen in our individuals who were doing Islamic prayer, that to me was so consistent with the tradition and what the overall notion of surrendering oneself to God is all about, that we see this reflected in the biology of the experience of the practice. So this was one scan, one individual. And here was another individual where the thin arrow, I thought this was very interesting. The thin arrow, this was a person who got it very deeply into prayer. The thin arrow is looking at the frontal lobes, which again shut down. But where the shorter, thicker arrow is, that's pointing at the area of the anterior cingulate. And this was a unique pattern that we hadn't seen in other kinds of practices, where the anterior cingulate, which is also an important kind of fulcrum between our frontal lobes and other areas of our brain, particularly our limbic areas, seems to become very active. And so that to me is fascinating, as how the Islamic prayer may help to kind of help us to regulate the emotional reactions and the responses that we have. Also, if you look, and I don't really have a way of pointing at this, but on the left side of the scan, you see kind of a bigger blob of red activity in the prayer state than on the baseline state. And this is part of the limbic areas as well. So this can be, this explains how the Islamic prayer is a deeply emotional process as well. And again, I think very consistent with how people describe the experiences to me about the sense of surrender, but feeling this overwhelming love of God. And so, it helps us to see what's going on in the brain. It shows the consistency of the experience with what's happening in the brain. And this leads us to begin to explore, okay, how different types of practices affect the brain. How do they change the brain over time? There's a lot of very interesting questions that can come up as a result of doing these kinds of studies, and to begin to explore them in more and more detail. So as I sort of wind down here, there is the larger epistemological aspect of all of this about, well, what do we actually conclude about the realness of these experiences? And I think ultimately, I have always argued that we have to be very careful about protecting both science and religion from uncertain claims about the nature of reality. We need to really think very carefully about what a brain scan study is doing and saying. As I usually say, when I had a group of Franciscan nuns who came in to do this same kind of research study, and we see changes in their brain, when they say that they feel connected to God, it doesn't prove that they're connected to God. It doesn't disprove that they're connected to God. It just shows me what's going on in their brain when they have that experience. So the same thing with the Islamic prayer. It doesn't prove anything about the prayer itself, but it tells us something about what's going on inside of the person. So ultimately, while we may at some point be able to make different epistemological claims, we have to do this very, very carefully. Too often people just say, oh, here's a brain scan, so clearly religion is nothing more than something that's going on in the brain, or clearly it's something much more than what's going on in the brain. We have to be very careful about any claims that are ultimately made from doing this kind of neurotheological research. But I think, to me, again, it's very exciting to think about what the possibilities will be going forward, as long as we do this as carefully as possible. So hopefully what I've shown you today is that neurotheology can be a very important field of scholarship. I think there are a lot of ways in which neurotheology can provide important information in the domain of science and medicine and psychiatry and psychology, helping us to understand who we are as human beings, how our religious and spiritual selves intersect with who we are as people. But also, I think neurotheology can provide important information in the domain of religion, asking questions, asking people what they believe, what they feel, what they experience, relating that to what's going on in their brain, helping us to understand questions about free will, consciousness, the mind, the soul, morality. There's so many different aspects for us to think about. And so hopefully this whole field will propel all of us, scientists, theologians, the everyday person, the religious person, the non-religious person, to understanding who we are as people, as individuals, and as human beings, and lead all of us to me, again, as an idealist and an optimist, towards some new enlightenment that brings our world together in far better ways than where we are right now. So I believe that is my last slide. If you do have an interest, you can take a look at a couple of the books that I have written on, specifically on neurotheology. The one was called Principles of Neurotheology, written about 10 years ago, and a more recent one just titled Neurotheology, which does explore a lot of the discussion about methods and where we are and what we've learned and how much more we're really just scratching the surface. There's so much more for us to be able to explore. And for those of you who are interested in looking at some of the research articles, you're welcome to go to my website, which is just andrewnewberg.com. And you can also connect with me through there. I love talking to people around the world. I've been actually working with some other individuals in the Middle East, looking at Islamic prayer and trying to study that in different kinds of ways and using MRI and so forth. Love to talk to people. And as I mentioned, I am very interested in exploring how neurotheology can engage all the different traditions, and Islam is certainly one of the ones that I have been working on and talking to other scholars in my vicinity, geographic vicinity, but love to hear more about what other people might think and how we can continue the dialogue. So thank you very much, and I will end it there. And if you have any questions, I guess I'll leave that up. I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Professor. Great, really great. I was really enjoying the talk, and it was a very nice summary of the term of the neurotheology. And the things that you were speaking about, I think it needs years to be resolved, so we have a final answer for them. But
Absolutely.
Yeah, but that's a very nice beginning for that. Not many people are courageous enough to do study in these fields because not many people are believing in those things, and they have some objections with that. But anyway, I really appreciate that. So my friends, if you have any question, just you can type it or you can raise your hand that I can activate your microphone. But the two questions that have already come, Majid is asking, what do you think about the role of pineal gland in spiritual experiences?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There has been some evidence that has looked at the pineal gland and some of the molecules that are produced by it, especially those that have evidence for being psychedelic kinds of compounds and can induce various types of psychedelic states. I don't know, at the moment, I don't know exactly how much that may have an impact on these intense spiritual experiences, but it is a great question and something that can be studied more. We can look at what is going on in a variety. When I showed the brain scans, we're primarily looking at things like blood flow, but we have started to do brain scans looking at different neurotransmitters and looking at serotonin and dopamine and the opiates and so forth. So there's a lot of new research that can be done. And of course, there are a lot of studies that are currently underway looking at the specific effects of psychedelic drugs like psilocybin and DMT and so forth. There's hundreds of different variations, both in terms of their clinical effect, helping people with depression, as well as eliciting different experiences. And again, it also gets back to is that okay? Is it appropriate to try to have a spiritual experience that is based on taking some kind of drug? And interestingly, there are shamanic cultures throughout the world who for thousands of years have used these different substances as a way of getting into a spiritual state. And they don't look at that as false or bad. But again, there's some big questions. But going back to the pineal gland, I think there's certainly the potential for a relationship there. And it is something that, we could start to look at whether there's an increase in those different molecules in the brain. Are there shifts that are going on at the serotonin system when people have these experiences? So I definitely think that that there's a lot to be learned there by looking at what's going on in the pineal gland. And I think there could be some very interesting results coming down the road.
Great, thank you, Professor. Although many people are just thanking you for your presentation, I'm only reading the questions. So Lida, your question was too long, so I need time to read it and ask the professor. But
I saw something about neurochemistry. Is that?
Yep, exactly.
But let me answer that, because that actually is follows a little bit of what we were just talking about. So yes, I think looking at that's going to be this whole other area of neurotheological research, which is to explore the neurotransmitters, the neurochemistry, and there are different ways of doing that. Again, part of what I get excited about are these what might be called orthogonal ways of getting at the question. So we did a brain scan study where we sent people through a spiritual retreat program, and I didn't show those slides here today, but where just going through an intensive spiritual program for a week changed their dopamine and their serotonin systems. So, that in and of itself is interesting. We can give a drug like psilocybin, which we know affects the serotonin system, and watch what kind of change occurs. There's been some interesting research looking at people with Parkinson's disease, where they lose the dopamine in their brain, and then that changes their religious and spiritual beliefs. So, we start to get at all of them. And actually, about 20 years ago, I published an article on the neurotransmitters and the neurochemistry of mystical experiences. And that model, in many ways, to me, still holds. I mean, we keep developing it. It had a lot. It sort of was a prelude to some of the network discussions that we hear today. So we had lots of different structures involved, but we started to sprinkle in where the neurotransmitters would be going and what would be happening. And for example, when I talk about the parietal lobe shutting down, we think that may be associated with a release of GABA, which is the gamma aminobutyric acid, a primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. And there was a MR spectroscopy study that showed that there was an increase in GABA in the brain. So, there's all these really fascinating approaches that can look at not just what the brain's basic activity is, but all the way down to the neurotransmitter, the neurochemical level, and then ultimately how that gets translated into the body itself, the autonomic nervous system changes, hormonal changes, immunological changes. So there's really a lot for us to be able to continue to explore. It's very exciting.
Great, thank you, Professor. So Lida is thanking you and asking a question. She says, in addition to praying and meditation-related terms and concepts, how about phenomena such as catharsis or acting out, which are used in psychoanalysis framework? They are claimed to be to induce the sense of clarity, unity, and etc. Could we consider some similarities between these, or is there any study for comparing these two terms?
And I'm sorry, what was the
catharsis? I'm not sure.
Catharsis.
Yeah.
I mean, I have not seen anything that directly relates to those two, but yes, certainly, there are a variety of psychotherapeutic interventions that work towards similar aims. Some people have worked hard to actually find ways of integrating psychotherapeutic interventions with religious and spiritual concepts and topics, because so often if you're depressed, then you're less engaging of your religion, for example, and you may not go to the mosque, or you may not you're just not up for doing the prayers or something like that. And if you can kind of turn the person around and utilize the religious and spiritual beliefs as part of the healing process, sometimes that can be very effective, for the right person. So yes, I and whether some of these other approaches, there's a full range from very secular to very spiritual that all potentially can be of value. Part of what I have kind of come to understand is that the advantage of the religious and the spiritual aspects typically is that people are kind of feel stronger about them. And so, part of what I say, it even goes back to the first slide I showed about, the atheist contemplating God. If you don't buy into it, it's not going to do very much for you. So if you are a religious individual, then engaging that religious side can be very valuable and very helpful, especially if you're confronted with stressors in your life or depression or diseases that you might be dealing with. At the same thing with meditation practices, if you're just doing a meditation because you're trying to de-stress, it may be helpful, and that'll it'll be a good experience for you, and it might reduce your anxiety, for example, but it's not going to get you to that other sort of spiritual level that may be more valuable and a more intense experience compared to somebody who really has a very strong belief in that particular tradition.
Thank you. Sepide is asking, as prayers affect the anterior cingulate, can we say that it will make people more sociable? Because it's activating the anterior cingulate. Does it have some effects on people becoming more sociable, being more involved in social activities?
Yes, a lot of the early work that I did with this Dr. DeQuilly had to do with rituals, and had the value of rituals and the practices that are part of those rituals, and whether it's singing, it's praying, it's various things that people do as part of their community. They are very pro-social, and in fact, between the anterior cingulate and then the reduction in the parietal lobe, which makes you feel connected to your group, to your community, whatever, that really does foster those pro-social behaviors, and there's it's a reciprocal. So being more social will help you to engage those practices a little bit more. But it also raises, so yes, I think there's definitely a relationship, and it can really help with helping people connect to their community more effectively, and that in turn winds up helping them to engage their spirituality more effectively. But it also raises another interesting question that I get asked a lot about, which is the difference between group practice versus individual practice. And some people prefer group, like to pray all together and go to the mosque and pray. Other people like to do it in their home and be by themselves. So and then we can ask questions about does one create a more intense experience, a different experience, and how do we try to understand all of that? And this is true of all traditions as well. That there's clearly people who enjoy going and being part of their group, and that becomes a very valuable part of their religious and spiritual beliefs. Other people, it's much more private and personal. It doesn't necessarily mean that one is better or worse, but it just leads them down different paths, and it may have a lot to do with just how we are all a little different individually. Some people are, more, we like to get together with all of our friends, and other people like to sit at home and read a book, and so it may just depend on each individual person.
Thank you, Professor. So I think 2 or 3 more questions and we will end the session. So Sopan is asking, what do you think about the default mode network changes before and after spiritual courses?
Yeah, so there's more and more interest in network analyses. There's been a lot of data that have been exploring the relationship between meditation and the default mode network as being part of that. And I think that the default mode network is certainly does play an important role. We've argued that a number of areas that are part of that default mode network do play a role during these practices. It changes the way it works, not just during the practice, but at baseline as well. And but there are also other networks as well. So the attentional network, salience network, things that engage our emotions, our cognitions, all when you think about religion and spirituality in its broadest context, they're so rich and diverse in terms of the things that people feel and experience. And for some, doing prayer is very cognitive. It's I have to say these things. For some, it's very emotional. I feel the love of God. For some, it's experiential. I feel it in my body. And some, it's all three. So when you think about the complexity of all of these practices and how the human person engages them, people say, well, is there, like one part of the brain that's religious or spiritual? No, everything that we've been saying is that there's lots of different parts of the brain, and it could be different for different individuals. And I've always argued that if there's a religious part of ourselves, it's our entire brain. And because the brain is connected to the body, it's all of us, So we, as an individual, have that religious aspect kind of ingrained throughout us, and that's part of why I think religion and spirituality has been such a universal part of humanity for since the beginning.
Thank you. So Majid is asking how I can better study this field. I think your books should be a good start, huh?
Well, the books are a good start. I've seen a couple of questions come up. We are trying to develop some programs to allow people to really pursue a more formal degree. I have been working with a couple of institutions here in the United States. We don't have anything yet, but there are some of the groups that I know of are. There's a group at Columbia University through Dr. Lisa Miller. There are a couple of other groups. There's one at George Washington University that's a little bit more in the health area. Duke University also. There's also Saybrook, the Saybrook University, which is one of the ones that I've been working on, seeing if we can create a program with them. So people can start to look in those different areas. And I would say that also, please keep in touch with me or let me know that you're interested through my website. And as I finally get to a point where we're able to offer this as a program, that we're going to try to do that, and we'll reach back out to people. In the short term, I usually let people know to pursue, topics that are similar. So psychology, neuroscience, medicine, and then, use your interest in neurotheology and trying to explore that to become part, to use that expertise to engage that. That's kind of what I did. I really started out as an imaging person who was fascinated by these questions and then could use my expertise in imaging to explore this. But there are people who are psychologists who use their expertise in psychology to explore religion and spirituality in psychological issues and problems. There's neuroscientists who are doing that. So there's some people up at Harvard who are looking at these kinds of questions as well. So it's gaining strength and it's gaining steam, and we're hoping to be able to offer something a little bit more definitive, but for now, a more traditional approach through psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and then bring in the neurotheology as you use your expertise to do that.
Thank you very much. We should end this session in 5 minutes. So Arvin, do you want to quickly ask your question? I'm activating your microphone.
Hello, you have my voice?
Hi there. Yes, I hear you.
Thanks for your excellent presentation. Also, thanks a lot to the organizers of this event. I want to say that, as you've mentioned earlier, psychedelic drugs, there are some psychedelic drugs, they can cause kind of esoteric situations for specific persons. So the prayers does. But there is a question to me, and it's mostly related to the perception, as this presentation was also philosophically rich. I want to say, how could we differ between the state of consciousness a person reaches to by psychedelic drugs, like mushrooms, like other drugs, and the person who is a kind of a skilled monk, for example, and practice more than, for example, 50 years, meditating every day, having a spiritual and physical exercises. How could we differ between two states of consciousness? And I think it's so kind of brightening and so difficult somehow to be answered, I think. And also, I want to say another point. We've seen that there are many researches conducted in the US, even I've read many in the field related to OBE, out-of-body experiences. It's quite intriguing, as you said. I want to see, is that also something could be contained in the neurotheology field? And also, we know that there are some tests, like also some researchers been conducted using TMS to stimulate parietal lobe, and it has caused out-of-body experiences. It was quite funny to me, and I've seen that it was being conducted there. So I want to know your opinion on it, and appreciate it so much. Thanks for
Sure. No, thank you. Great questions. Yeah, I'll take the last one first. So out-of-body experience is certainly part of the neurotheology world, and they are certainly a part of many religious and spiritual states and experiences, especially mystical ones. And as you mentioned, I mean, that's just another piece of the neurotheology puzzle, which is other ways of stimulating these experiences through things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, and people have been looking at that. I think you raise an important concern. We did report through our survey that those individuals who had experiences under the influence of psychedelics, at least in terms of the narrative description, were extremely similar to those people who had a more, quote unquote, natural religious or spiritual experience. So it does raise some concerns about that. I think, part of the answer is that context is always important. And so, if a certain drug may help someone down a path, that can be helpful. But there's still the larger philosophical and religious perspectives that need to be understood and taken care of. And so, it doesn't eliminate a person pursuing their religious and spiritual goals, a monk, pursuing that in some detail over a lifetime, because that has meaning for them to do that. Now, for somebody who doesn't feel that they can do that, to get a taste of that experience and to maybe transform themselves to a certain extent, we'll have to see, whether or not and how much these kinds of other induced states really have that ability to do that, and to what extent, but I don't think it takes away, the realness of the experiences that people have. But by the same token, we also need to recognize the potential that even the drug-induced experiences can have a great deal of realness and transformational power with people. But again, it still becomes context dependent, and does it change them in a way that's positive and beneficial and enables them to kind of engage themselves in the world more effectively. So I'm excited about this work, but I do have a great deal of trepidation about it too, and want to make sure that it proceeds carefully and ethically, and that we're aware of these various complex issues. In fact, that's part of what I think neurotheology helps with, because if you just have a drug-induced state kind of out of context, then you don't really know what it does or what it means. But if you can kind of bring it back into it, we might be able to say, okay, it has a value, but there's other aspects to it that are missing, or that are important, or that you might want to engage now that you've had that experience. So it becomes much more complex, but it is important for us to think about it. It's exciting to see the work, but we have to proceed carefully. And again, I think at the very least, it does not eliminate in any way, shape, or form the value of mystical experiences, no matter how they're ultimately derived.
Thank you very much, Professor. So I just want to ask the final question, and then we will finalize. Sorry for taking too much of your time. Do you think that when somebody considers himself as an atheist, do you think that's only a conscious thought, and if we investigating unconsciously, he might have some belief in that?
Right. Well, I've always argued that that even for somebody who is an atheist who may not believe in God per se, that we all have this kind of spiritual part of ourselves. We all want to connect with something greater than the self, and whether that person feels that it's the universe or, you know, humanity or something, you know, there's certainly that element of it. Whether or not the actual belief in God, you know, whether they do have something unconscious or not. Again, I mean, I think your question is a great neurotheological question, you know, to take people who are atheists and to try to see what they believe and what they don't. I was just relayed, this is sort of tangential, but they did a little informal study on a television show one time where they brought in a group of about 8 people who were all really atheistic, total materialists. You know, they didn't believe in anything supernatural. And in the room, they were passing around a pen that they were, you know, that had some historical significance, they were told. And then at one point they say, well, this pen was owned and used by Adolf Hitler. And suddenly none of them wanted to touch it. Now, if you don't believe in the supernatural, then it's just a pen. But if you believe that there's somehow something that can go from me to the pen, you know, or go from Hitler to the pen, then suddenly, you know, you don't want to touch it. So there are some inherent things that we all feel about how the world works, and so, you know, yes, I would think that in many ways, even though they may consciously have decided that it doesn't, you know, they have trouble understanding it, there are aspects within each of us that are trying to understand these bigger questions. And so I do think that on some fundamental level, we all have that spiritual urge. How it winds up getting expressed, and whether it gets expressed through a more traditional religion, whether it gets expressed through music, literature, creativity, science, you know, there are many different ways that it winds up getting expressed. And that also, to me, is part of what neurotheology shows us, which is to sort of have an openness and an understanding for people who have different perspectives, and to try to understand them and to help us understand each other.
Thank you very much, Professor. I personally enjoyed a lot this meeting, and it was really beneficial for me. I'm sure the audience has also, they're still thanking you for the talk. And
Well,
it was really great. And from now on, I'm inviting you to this country, to Iran, for the time that we do not have COVID-19 anymore.
I would love to come. I would.
Sure.
My boss, Dr. Alavi, my mentor, and really almost a second father to me, has always wanted me to come to his homeland.
Sure. So just wait for the invitation to come, and let's hope for this COVID-19 after that.
That sounds great. I would love it.
Thank you very much. Thank you again. And it was indeed an honor for us.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.